The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. I just want to say thank you for joining us for this TACA webinar. If you're new, I just wanted to let everyone know that you'll have a chance to ask questions and we'll be answering them at the conclusion of today's presentation. But you can go ahead and you can type them at any time on the control panel on the right. There's a question tab that you can type in your questions and we'll do our very best to answer as many as possible. Also, at the conclusion of today's webinar, you'll receive a short survey. And if you fill out that survey, we'll be sending you the slides from today's presentation. So we are so excited about today's topic, preconception, environmental prevention strategies. And today our presenter is Nicole Rincon. So thank you, Nicole, for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, of course. So today, as you mentioned, we're going to do preconception environmental piece. As you mentioned also, I'm Nicole. I work at Rosignol Medical Center with Dr. Dan Rosignol, Lanier Rosignol, nurse practitioner, his wife, Dr. Dave Fliebner. So we have a big center. And this is my contact info. If you have any questions, want to call, email, send look on our website. You have that information there. Again, this is actually a two-part seminar. So today I'm doing the environmental piece. And Lanier, in 2 weeks from today, Lanier Rosignol, my friend and colleague, she's going to be doing the parent health supplementation, kind of more the medical testing and supplement side of it. But I'm looking for, environmentally what to avoid or do or not do. So with that being said, I do want to also let you know today I'm going to be presenting a lot of clinical data. So with the environmental piece, there's a lot of speculation. Now, is it different toxins or vaccines or things in the water, and air, whatnot. So we're really looking at clinical trials and what the data has shown and trying to remove some of that speculation, although of course it always exists. For the disclaimer, this is just saying that I'm not giving specific medical advice, of course, for you or your children. So before you do anything, especially pre-pregnancy, always see a doctor so that they can work you up, talk about what to avoid, what not to, in addition to everything we're talking about today. A little bit about me. I am a physician assistant. I've been a PA for over 10 years. I've been doing a lot of nutritional counseling, wellness supplementation, and I've actually been at Rosignol Medical Center now for 2 years and earning my, I just received my MAPS fellowship certification. Just please give me 2 minutes for my backstory here. I was married 10 years ago, and after unfortunately a long, arduous process of conception difficulties, I gave birth to triplets. They were born at 34 weeks and extremely happy kids, healthy kids, no birth issues. I was super blessed, super lucky. And of course, you see where the story is kind of ending here. At 15 months, my son Ryan stopped responding to pretty much all external stimuli, including his name and even pain around him. My son Alexander, at 25 months, while we were working Ryan up for autism, he lost all of his speech, and his regression was so severe, he lost over 100 words, any social interaction, pretty much all of his cognition. He regressed severely. And then my daughter, 1 month later, began having seizures. So this is now, thank God, been, over 3 or 4 years now. And I can tell this story without crying because this is actually a good story. I pulled myself up. I went to MAPS, met Dr. Rosignol, started doing all these MAPS treatments, biomedical treatments. But I remember when I had no hope and was so scared, and I now feel good. I now feel like we're on the right path, that I have some answers, and more importantly, that I have help. If I don't have all the answers, I know people to go to, and they don't have all the answers either. Nobody does, but hopefully I can share some of that hope with you. And the big part is too, why we're here is prevention. I mean, prevention is the key, and we always want the best for our kids. Sometimes it starts really slow. You have to start from the beginning. I really hope that I can impart some information to you today to help. So of course now my kids are almost 6. Ryan is completely, regained his receptive language. He's talking all the time. We can have a conversation about, spaceships and, scary monsters. Alex is now totally recovered his speech as well, and Vivian's seizure free. So my kids are doing pretty well. We're not out of the woods. They're still on the spectrum, but hopefully we're going to keep working just like you guys are. So the point is of this whole talk, is we're doing environmental because unfortunately kids with autism, siblings are affected more. So we know that 18% of infants who developed autism had at least one older sibling. So, in the general population, they say it's about 1 in 50 or so, about 2% of kids. But if you have an older sibling with autism, that rate goes up to 18% versus 2%. And there's almost a 3 times higher risk factor for males. So if you have a second child that's a boy, 3 times risk factor, and additional twofold if you have more than one older sibling. So if you have 2 brothers, let's say, with autism, and you have a third son, it's probably likely, unless you do some intervention, that child would have autism, statistically. Again, this is a study, same thing, basically showing in a different way that the overall recurrence rate for autism was 6.9. So again, it's basically saying that you're almost 7 times likely to have a child with autism if you have an older sibling with autism. The relative recurrence risk I found was really interesting. So if you have half brothers and sisters, there's a risk factor on either side. So when I read this study, I'd assumed that there'd be a risk factor on the mom's side. Like, okay, well, so the mom's paternal, womb setting would be maybe a risk factor for autism. And so you see that half siblings, there's a 2.4 increase in risk of having a child with autism. But even on the paternal side, so even if they have different moms and they just have the same dad with a sibling with autism, a half sibling, there's still an increased risk. So it doesn't appear to just be the mom or the maternal environment. There are paternal risk factors as well, and we will review that as well. I really love this, and this is kind of why we're here. Why are we having this whole talk and this conversation? Dr. Mumper, who has just been a pioneer in our fields, just pioneering for autism recovery, she wrote a paper, and it basically talked about autism being implicated or impacted by environment, breastfeeding, gut flora, nutritional status, Tylenol, vaccines, antibiotics. All these things are coming together to maybe create this, unfortunately, a bad environment that might promote autism. But the good news is, in a retrospective clinical analysis, so basically she has a practice with general pediatrics, not autism specific pediatrics, but in her general practice, 0 out of 294 kids had a recurrence rate of autism. So when she basically counseled these mothers, what to do and how to screen them, none of her kids out of 300 almost were born with autism, versus the general population is about 2%, right? So we'd expect out of 300 kids there to be about 6 with autism in her population, but hers, she had 0. So she's postulating that basically, if we control these risk factors, if we screen for these things, if we remove the environmental toxins, screen the mothers, we can greatly reduce the number of autism children, that we see that are born. So that's a huge perk, and we're really working off of that. This is a Wang study. He was written last year, and he actually took 37,000 kids and tried to aggregate data together to see in the various periods of prenatal, perinatal, which is basically the around the gestational period when the baby's inside the mother, and postnatal, after the baby's born, what are the risk factors? Again, these are correlation, not necessarily causation, but these seem to be risk factors. Maternal age greater than 35, and paternal, both parents. Mother and father's race, white or Asian. So being white or Asian seems to be a risk factor versus other ethnicities. Gestational hypertension, gestational diabetes. So, different pregnancy issues. If you interestingly have maternal or paternal education, college graduate plus. So the higher educated parents seem to be producing more kids with autism, interestingly. And again, any kind of threatened abortion or antepartum hemorrhage, bleeding during pregnancy, just problems during the pregnancy is a risk factor for autism. Around the time of delivery, he found that C-section, birth less than 36 weeks, greater than parity means how many kids you have. So if there's a fourth kid or more in the family, then that is a greater risk factor for autism. Spontaneous labor, induced labor, basically anything wrong with the labor process itself, preeclampsia, fetal distress. These are risk factors for autism in the perinatal. And then postnatal, we have low birth weights, postpartum hemorrhage, male gender, which we know, and brain anomalies. These are kind of what he aggregated. And I like the fact that he separated it between pre, peri, and post. So we're going to try and do that for my talk. And, what can you do before you get pregnant? What can you do while you're pregnant? Maybe a couple things after you give birth. So these couple slides were studies I found exposure for before pregnancy. So we look at 3 studies, did have different chemicals they said that were risk factors. So these 3 different studies had a kind of a myriad, a bunch of different chemicals that said that it posed some risk. In the McNally study in 2012, he specifically named lacquer, varnish, xylene, asphalts before pregnancy. So you don't even have to be exposed to these chemicals while you're pregnant, even before, were associated with autism. This is kind of more during pregnancy. So, I mean, some of these are a little more obvious. I think most of our mothers know at this point that smoking during pregnancy probably isn't good for any fetus. There were 3 studies indicating that was a risk for autism. 3 studies indicated that gestational exposure to pesticides was increased risk. So this is a key too, because even when you're pregnant, those pesticides are getting to the baby or seeming to affect somehow the baby's developmental growth in all 3 studies. And we're actually going to see further studies about pesticides in the future here. And gestational exposure to phthalates was associated with ASD symptoms. Phthalates are essentially a plastic type softener. It's not a plastic per se. It's almost like a resin that actually makes plastic a little more flexible. So unfortunately, it's seen in a lot of a lot of different vinyl flooring. So if you have vinyl in your house, personal care products, some like a lot of cosmetics, and even children's toys, anything to soften plastic will often have phthalates, which can be a big deal. One study reported that maternal residence during the 3rd trimester or delivery was more likely to be located near a freeway in the ASD group. So they're postulating in this study that if you live near a freeway, you're getting a lot more emissions, and that seems to be a risk factor, all the emissions from cars on the freeway. And actually, there's more studies that back this up as well, and we'll talk about that. Gestational exposure in another study to 35 air pollutants was significantly associated with autism. And several studies reported that alcohol exposure, of course, was associated with autism. So not a big surprise, the smoking, the alcohol, but here we're looking at air pollution. So that's something that, can be hard to control depending on what country or what city in the world that you live in. And this I thought was very interesting study. Despite the fact that studies show that the higher education parents have is a risk factor for autism, maternal knowledge about environmental toxins was lower, and exposure to common household toxicants was higher during gestation in mothers with kids with autism. So what they're basically saying is that before the kids were diagnosed with autism while the mothers were pregnant, the mothers didn't know about some of these toxicants, the vinyl flooring or the even the smoke or the alcohol, which it kind of surprises me. I think maybe I have a biased opinion because my population is so intelligent. I mean, I'm biased. I deal with the TACA moms all day, and they are smart women. But maybe we had to educate ourselves because our children were diagnosed with autism, or who knows? Maybe I see a specific sample, but that is what this study showed here. And then also toxicants were implied in a lot of cohort studies. Basically, Dr. Rosignol reviewed several studies and kind of aggregated the data, and he postulated that toxicants implicated were pesticides, the phthalates, PCBs, solvents, toxic waste sites, air pollution, and heavy metals. But the strongest evidence he found for which were risk factors for autism were air pollution and the pesticides. So those seem to be less inconclusive. And I'll show you more studies down the line. There were some that were kind of on the fence, but the air pollution and pesticides were pretty much a slam dunk as far as being large risk factors for autism. And again, just to mention, PCBs, you might say, what is a PCB? They're basically flame retardants. So they're found in, unfortunately, all over our environment. One of the biggest culprits I find with our kids is their clothing, their bedtime clothing. So their flame retardant, liner, the spray that they put on these kids so that they don't catch fire at night, but they actually have PCBs that might be disrupting their hormones and causing toxicity. And also Rosignol in the paper, he kind of tied it all together. A lot of people have this exposure. So a lot of people live in high pollution areas or, are exposed to a lot of pesticides. And there were 10 unique studies that examined the polymorphisms in genetics associated with an increased susceptibility. So if your genes make you more susceptible to some of these toxins, and 8 studies reported that these polymorphisms, these gene deficits, were more common in ASD individuals. So for the genes implicated in this study were the PON1 gene. So essentially, this is a gene that helps break down organophosphates. If you don't have this gene, pesticides are extremely toxic to you, and we see this gene deficit in a lot of kids with autism. The glutathione transferase, a lot of kids have a lot of glutathione issues that I see in my practice. And as we know, you can't detoxify anything without glutathione. So a lot of substances will become toxic if you have a mutation with glutathione recycling. There's an ALAD gene and a MTF gene, and these have to do with more metal processing. The ALAD is more for the porphyrin and the heme biosynthesis, to get technical, but it can affect basically metal regulation. And then the MTF gene, we see it delayed the onset of apoptosis. So basically, this gene, this metal regulatory gene, can affect the pruning of cells and how cells are, regulated. And so there might be a dysregulation or overgrowth of cells if you have this gene, and especially with toxic metals exposure, which a lot of our kids have. So again, it seems like there may be toxic exposures plus the gene susceptibility. Now, currently, we unfortunately can't change our genes. I wish we could, and I think we will, in the future, but right now we're working with changing our environment. I took out several abstracts. I apologize if it's hard to read, but this is from a paper that, again, aggregated a ton of data looking at what we're looking at. What are the risk factors in various populations with different studies put together? And I found this one interesting. This basically shows that children with migrant mothers had a higher risk of autism. So 6 out of the 10 studies found that a mom that moved to the United States from another country and gave birth had a much higher risk factor for having a child with autism. The only exception for that was the Hispanic mothers, who actually had a lower rate of autism. So the Hispanic race seems to be spared for whatever reason, but if I see it maybe for a lot of Indian patients I have, Asian, just different races that when they come here, they seem to have more difficulty. Maybe detoxifying, I don't know. It's hard to know specifically what's going on here. We have here, this is just preconception chemical exposures. So all studies showed an increased rate of preconception chemical exposure. Now, these were not very good studies, and it didn't really name which specific chemicals. But in the middle slide here, in the middle section, you'll see that all studies out of 4 showed an increased risk of autism with gestational exposure to organophosphates, which are pesticides. So this showed that the mom is pregnant, her eating organophosphates, the pesticides, is a risk factor for autism. And on the last slide here, on the last section here, you'll see that one study showed an association between the childhood exposure as well. So it's one thing for the mom to be pregnant, but once the child is young, let's say 6 months old, that exposure also increases the risk of autism. So, and these are various pesticides the DDE, the phosphine, you see there's different kinds, but all of them, for whatever reason, appear to be, or the ones that they listed here, are risk factors for autism. So it's not just one type of pesticide. It seems to be different types of pesticides that are greatly affecting our children and their autism risk factor. Again, we mentioned 6 studies, and all of them showed an increased risk of autism with air pollution. So that seems to be a very big risk factor. And it's a risk factor just like the pesticides. It's a risk factor during the prenatal period, before the mom gets pregnant, while the mom is pregnant, but also in that second line, you'll see air pollution during childhood is also associated with it. So the kid gets exposed in the utero, but also after birth, that can cause autism or contribute to affecting his autism. Exposure in the third line here, exposure to other chemicals. There were some mixed results, and they didn't exactly name all the solvents and toxicants. So some things are, like I said, kind of on the fence, depending on which study you look at. But toxic waste sites, 2 studies, both of them showed association with autism. So if you live near a toxic dump, a toxic waste site, a Superfund site, you're at a higher risk of having a child with autism. And water pollution. I thought this was interesting in 2 ecologic studies, which are not very strong, but there was no association between water chlorination and autism. So at least for those studies, it didn't seem to be a risk factor. I'm not going to necessarily read all of these, but if you look at the top, heavy metals, 7 studies showed association between mercury and autism. 1 study showed no association. So there does seem to be metal toxicity issues with autism as a risk factor. The second line here, the polyvinyl chloride, the basically vinyl flooring, was a risk factor versus wood flooring. Possibly going back to those PCBs like we mentioned. All these studies, essentially mercury, lead, cadmium, aluminum, arsenic, nickel, uranium, and tin, all these, when they did tissue biopsies of the kids with autism, showed elevated levels in at least half. It looks like some of them are about a quarter, some of them are about a half of the studies. So it's kind of inconclusive. Some kids seem to have metal issues, some kids do not. They didn't study the mothers. I couldn't find any specific studies with the mothers with metals in pregnancy, but these children do seem to have a metal burden. A lot of them do. If you look at the bottom section here, it says heavy metals and severity. So there's 7 correlational studies, and they said all studies showed some correlation between autism severity and heavy metals, particularly lead and mercury. And the relationship suggests a dose response. So what that means is when the kids have metals, if they have lead and mercury, typically the higher the levels, the more severe their autism symptoms are. So not all kids necessarily have metals, but when they do, it seems like it's exacerbating and or contributing to their autism profile. So definitely metal exposure can be, and avoidance can be really, really important. Solvents, pesticides, PCBs, again, this showed that one showed that there was above normal levels in kids, another one showed no association. So some of these are a little weaker as far as association with autism. Phthalates, 3 studies showed no, 3 studies showed risk factor, 2 studies that showed no risk factor. PBDEs, again, none of these are kind of slam dunks as far as absolutely being a risk factor. But valproic acid is actually a seizure medication that a lot of parents, or mothers can be on if they have seizure disorder during pregnancy. And all studies found a significant and strong association between prenatal valproate exposure and autism. So definitely, if you have seizures, if you are on valproate, that seems to be a very strong risk factor. Maybe talk to your doctor about switching medications to control that. And I found this study really interesting. There's a lot of speculation on whether or not fertility treatments contributed to autism risk factors. And interestingly, out of 8 studies, 3 showed a positive association. So 3 showed that assistive reproductive technology was associated with autism. 3 showed there was no association, and 1 actually showed a negative association. So it was actually protective. So it seems that it's kind of inconclusive. You know, whether or not the fertility issues, maybe they're getting screened more, the mothers, resolving some of their thyroid issues or anemia issues beforehand, or perhaps, you know, who knows? It's not related. This is basically what I was mentioning earlier, where, you know, we always think of the mothers, and initially they used to blame autism on the mothers, and we know that's not true. I mean, we see the studies. Study after study shows, like this mentioned, 27 studies in meta-analysis showed that the lowest parental age category was associated with a reduced risk of autism, and the highest parental age was associated with an increased risk of autism. I'm sorry, paternal age. So essentially, if they're 10 years older, let's say, there was a 18% risk factor increase for autism and 21% increase if the dad was 10 years older. So increased age is a risk factor for both males and females in having a child with autism. Timing of conception. So this is a big one. This is something that we can change. There was a large study basically showing that children conceived in December, January, February, or March had a higher risk of developing autism. So basically these winter months seem to be a risk factor in conception. So actually when you get pregnant, maybe it's due to lower vitamin D, or who knows. But the best time it showed to have children in these studies was in July. Summer months seem to be a lower risk of autism compared to winter conception. You're going to see several slides right now talking about pregnancy of spacing. So essentially it's showing IPIs, inter-pregnancy intervals. They define that as when the first child is born to when the day of birth to the conception of the second child, the next child. That they consider that the inter-pregnancy interval. And if that is less than 12 months, the child is at a 3.39 higher risk of autism. So really jumps up. When it goes to 12 to 23, it's 1.8. So it still is an increased risk. 24 to 35 bumps down to 1.26. So with a couple years spacing, the risk factor goes way down relative. And then this study says that greater than 36 months is ideal. And the highest risk, as I mentioned, was associated with pregnancy less than a year. So if you're considering having a child, it might be good to space those kids out. You know, I would do maybe, according to this study, maybe 2 years. But some of the studies are different. So again, this is another study showing that children born with pregnancy interval of less than 12 months had an increased risk of autism. But it's also an increased risk of developmental delays and cerebral palsy. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be autism. So any kind of developmental issue can be associated with a shorter pregnancy duration or inter-pregnancy interval. 3 of these studies were reported also an association between long IPIs and increased risk of autism. So I'll show you in the next slide here. Kaiser did a study and showed that the 2 to 3-fold risk increase was for kids less than 12 months or greater than 72 months. So, you know, greater than 5-6 years might be a risk factor as well as less than 1 year. So they were saying that in this paper that the best optimal time would be 36 to 47 months. Now, of course, for us moms that are trying to get pregnant, that can be really stressful to time it exactly right. Life doesn't always work that way, but it is something to think about and aim for. Stress during pregnancy. I laugh every time I read this. I mean, who doesn't have stress in their lives? But this basically showed that prevalence of autism increased in a dose response to the severity of storm exposure, actually, in Louisiana. So they measured the storm activity and when kids were born and how far along moms were pregnant. And they showed that if there was more storms near the middle or end of the gestation, which they associated with increased stress, that the kids had a higher risk of autism. So some things like storms you can't control. You know, stress in general is a hard thing for us moms with kids on the spectrum. You know, like I said, I kind of laugh at the idea, but we do the best we can. There are definitely a lot of strategies and, you know, meditation, yoga, and things that we need to take care of ourselves. Because we know stress does seem to be a risk factor. This is another study showing that a higher incidence of prenatal stressors was found in autism at 21 to 32 weeks, with a peak of 25 to 28 weeks. So they basically did surveys of moms. They had them fill out forms and how, stressed out they were, and what stressful events might have happened in their lives during their pregnancy. And so they're saying in this paper that this stress in the late second trimester, early third trimester, might be around the time when the cerebellum is changing in these kids and developing in the womb. So maybe those stressors are a risk factor for autism. So again, do the best you can to reduce stress if possible. Prenatal ultrasound. There are some inconclusive results. Essentially, analysis. So Abramowitz, he is, let's see, I wrote it down here. I know that he basically advises, I believe, for the FDA. But anyway, he wrote an analysis of in utero exposure in humans and has failed to show harmful effects in neonates or children, particularly in performance, attention, behaviors. So studies aren't showing it. However, he urges in this paper that he wrote in 2012 that ultrasound is a form of energy with effects in the tissue it traverses. So it should be used and restricted for medical indications by doctors or technicians for shortest period and low intensity as possible. So there's a lot of kids out there that do these 3D ultrasounds, and they want to see the face and they want to see the picture, and that's probably not a great idea. The studies are, like, as I mentioned, inconclusive, but it's essentially, why do it? Why expose your child to this risk factor? You're going to see him eventually, right? And Abramowitz is the chair of safety committee of the World Federation of Ultrasound Medicine and Biology. So his focus is on safety, and he's saying consider maybe not doing it. Prenatal ultrasound, there was a retrospective analysis of autism in the genetic repository. So what they found is that males with autism and copy number variants, and copy number variants are basically where genes might be duplicated in some of these kids, and exposure to first trimester ultrasound had decreased verbal skills and repetitive behaviors compared to males with autism, the same copy number variants, but no ultrasound. So this paper by Webb is saying that, autism may result from exposure to ultrasound with kids that are specifically genetically vulnerable. So if you're not genetically vulnerable, then it won't be an issue, like a lot of these things. But if you are, ultrasounds might be a big deal. So again, use them sparingly. They can be helpful for diagnosing issues during pregnancy. I wouldn't avoid them. Certainly if there's a problem, but I wouldn't get anything more than you absolutely need to. Let's see here. Vaccination during pregnancy. So this was a study done at Kaiser Permanente, and it showed that maternal influenza or influenza vaccination anytime during pregnancy was not associated with an increased autism risk. However, in the paper, it also mentions when they analyzed in specific trimesters, the first trimester was the only period associated with an increased risk of autism. So there was, it seemed to be when they isolated it, an increased risk of autism in the first trimester. So I think this is why generally the recommendation is don't get a flu vaccine during the first trimester, but the other ones are okay. The paper states that there was a suggestion of an increased risk for mothers who received a flu vaccine, but the association was not statistically significant, that the finding might be due to chance. So again, most parents, I think, now are tending to err on the side of caution. I certainly would. But, getting the flu, is not for the faint of heart either. So, I definitely, though, the studies, I would definitely avoid it during the first trimester. Delivery considerations. I think most people are kind of aware of this by now, but the studies are showing that the C-section is associated with increased risk of autism, possibly ADHD, when compared to vaginal delivery. Another study that showed breastfeeding. Breastfeeding seems to really come up a lot in these studies with autism. So ASD was found to be associated with late initiation of breastfeeding, a non-intake of colostrum, prelacteal feeding, and bottle feeding. And the risk was found to be dose dependent. So the least amount of breast milk the baby had, the bigger the risk of autism. The more breast milk over the time of the baby's life, the less risk of autism. So, again, I always think of my pregnancy, and after I gave birth to my triplets at 34 weeks, I was in the hospital for a couple days, and I pumped every 4 hours, and I was trying my hardest to get my breast milk to come. And it took me about 5 or 6 days, and I didn't think it was going to happen. I took all these supplements, and I remember the lactation consultant coming into the hospital, and she was just really laying into me. Oh, you have to try harder. You're not doing this right, and you can't be, this is so important, and you can't be lazy about this. And she was telling me this, and I was just crying, and I felt this pressure, and of course that probably wasn't good for breast milk production. So you do the best you can. That's my point, is that if your breast milk's not coming in, well, just keep trying. Whenever it comes in, give them as much as you can, however much you can. We're all doing the best we can, but get some breast milk. And there's no studies here. I didn't find any, but I have heard a lot of other moms that have breast milk issues, getting a donor breast milk that's been screened. That definitely seems to be preferable over formula for a lot of the autism risk factors. So, although I haven't found that in a specific study, but I know a lot of moms that do that with some pretty good success. Again, another Spanish multi-center study showing that longer duration of breastfeeding was associated with better cognitive development with fewer autistic traits. So we've kind of known this for a while. More breast milk equals better IQ in general for even non-autistic populations. So it seems to be protective. There was a study of a mother-child pairs, and basically the risk factors they found were high mean paternal age, so high father age, need for resuscitation at birth, NICU stay, late initiation of breastfeeding, maybe due to the lack of colostrum intake, neonatal seizures, all those were associated with it, with an increased risk of autism. And they found that exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months of life is associated with a decreased risk of autism. So that would be ideal if that's possible. Again, do best you can. I thought this was very interesting. So they did a study about breastfeeding low-risk infants. The prevalence of GI symptoms did not vary with diet or age of weaning. So if you have a low-risk infant and you take them off breast milk early and put them on formula, they didn't seem to have any GI symptoms. But constipation in particular was really prevalent in high-risk infants for autism when compared to low-risk infants and a no breast milk diet. So essentially what that means is that kids that are higher risk for autism, they seem to be more susceptible to being taken away from this breast milk. When you take away the breast milk, they get more constipated than a lower risk autism child would. So for these kids that are higher risk, weaning earlier than 6 months showed a greater prevalence of constipation and abdominal distress. So, perhaps, breastfeeding for 6 months a year will be protective of their own microbiome, or who knows, but, their constipation and abdominal distress seems to go down. And so this paper postulates that GI dysfunction during early infant development may be part of the ASD endophenotype, which most of us moms out there, a lot of us can attest to that. These kids never had quite normal poops even from birth. And of course, constipation is an ongoing issue for a lot of kids. Tylenol. So we're going to talk about Tylenol. Most of us know it's probably not great, but long-term exposure during pregnancy was associated with psychomotor, behavioral, and temperamental outcomes at 3 years of age. So, I'm going to run through a few studies here, but there's a lot that say that Tylenol is not good, essentially, for child development. Interestingly, prenatal exposure to Motrin or ibuprofen was not associated with adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes. So if you have an issue, pain during pregnancy, you might want to consider ibuprofen. However, it's not recommended during the 3rd trimester. So again, speak to your physician. I mean, I would be very wary about any kind of medication I put in my body when I'm pregnant. But certainly Motrin does seem safer than Tylenol, as you're going to see here. Another study, prenatal use of paracetamol, which is Tylenol, was correlated with autism in a country level data. So they're basically taking a ton of data. And, you know, so this is not just in our country. Tylenol, another study again. So this is basically showing that ever exposed offspring's at a higher risk of presenting more hyperactivity, impulsivity. So they're basically saying in this study that not only is Tylenol dangerous, but the amount you use. So the increased effect size is increased by frequency. So if you're taking it every day, multiple times a day versus you took it once, seems to be a greater risk factor. The more you take, the more risk factor it is. And it seems to be correlated with hyperactivity, impulsivity symptoms in children. So what they found is that Tylenol exposure was associated with a great number of autism in males, but also showed adverse effects for attention in both genders, including females. So even when the females don't have autism, if they're exposed to Tylenol, they seem to have more, you know, ADD, ADHD type symptoms than non-exposed kids. And also, like I mentioned, the frequency. So the more exposure, more risk factor. Again, this is kind of showing here that Tylenol use was associated with hyperkinetic symptoms. So just hyperactivity, you know, the kids that are always moving, but not with other autism cases. So this is saying that there may be a type of autism or just a subset of, you know, different expression of how, you know, how kids, what their symptomology is. And the more hyper kids may be the ones that were more exposed to Tylenol, and Tylenol may not be a risk factor for other kids that are not as hyperactive. Again, longer duration of use was associated with an increased risk of the symptoms, almost twofold. So the more you're using, the higher risk again. These studies, there was several different ones that basically just said any type of medication during pregnancy was associated with autism. So I'm kind of on board with this. You know, I mean, less is always more, especially when you're pregnant. So one study reported that terbutaline, which is basically an asthma type medication, you know, bronchodilates and helps you breathe, but terbutaline exposure for more than 2 days during the third trimester was associated with an increased risk of autism. So in this particular case, it doesn't necessarily have to be dose dependent. I mean, 2 days is not very long exposure. So you have an asthma attack, you use your inhaler for 2 days, and boom, you're at an increased risk of autism. So definitely making sure that your asthma is under control, you know, so that you don't need these medications might be a big issue. Again, this is talking about epilepsy and the valproate. So I know I mentioned this earlier, but there is a study showing that increased risk of neurodevelopmental disorders in children with exposure to sodium valproates compared with controlled children. So valproic acid, again, common seizure medication, studies showing that it's an increased risk. No significant increase was found when kids were exposed to different kinds of seizure medications, the carbamazepine or lamotrigine. So again, not all seizure medications are equal. So, you know, if you're on valproate, talk to your doctor about switching to another medication to control your seizures, because that might greatly reduce their risk of autism. Another paper written in 2014 just about the risks of valproate, saying that it increased the risk of reduced IQ scores, behavioral problems, and may lead to a further diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And this author was saying that it should be really labeled as category X, which means that it's teratogenic and causes birth defects. It's that strongly correlated. And again, this is talking about the terbutaline, the beta-2 adrenergic agonists. So we mentioned that kind of drug earlier, but most commonly we all know is albuterol. So about albuterol use during pregnancy was associated with increased risk of autism. And it wasn't just the last trimester. I mean, the risk factor was associated during preconception, first, second, and third trimester. So any use during the mom's life, you know, especially obviously during any point in the pregnancy, is an increased risk. So again, you need, you know, it's great to talk to your doctor, figure out how to control this asthma before you get pregnant, if you're using this medication regularly. And this is another study. I like this because I've always kind of known this, that the flea and tick medications commonly used for pets, the imidacloprid, it increases the risk of autism slightly, they said, in prenatal exposure. However, if you limit it to the frequent users of this flea and tick medication, it increased to 2. So this seems to be dose dependent as well. So if you're using it a lot, or your kid, you're constantly putting it on your pets once a month or whatnot, then that's a higher risk factor as if you were exposed to it one time. So, and this seems to interestingly show that the window of analysis, basically, that exposures during pregnancy were a higher risk of autism than early in life. So when the kids are developing in the mom's womb, that's when they're more susceptible to this flea and tick medication versus when the kids are infants. It seems to be less of a risk factor. So if your kid, your pets in your home have fleas and ticks, try to find maybe a natural or some other way to control the pests versus using these medications. Systematic review. This is always a big important one. So there was a big study showing that SSRI, moms that take serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Zoloft, Prozac, Lexapro, they had a significantly higher risk of autism than the non-SSRI group. So you're thinking, oh wow, that medication might be causing it. But when they confined it to those born to the women with psychiatric disorders, the group did not show an increased risk. So what that means is that, let's say the moms who were diagnosed with anxiety and or depression, that seems to be the risk factor for autism, not the actual medication. So the moms with anxiety, depression were the risk factor. The medication seems to just be a confounding variable. So again, figuring out the underlying cause of the anxiety, depression, maybe it's toxicity or, some kind of vitamin deficiency or dysbiosis. So those seem to be risk factors. But again, if you're a vet man, I wouldn't want to take any medication. So the goal would be ideally to figure out what's going on and hopefully to deal with your anxiety and depression in a more, natural way if possible. Sometimes it's not. Of course, talk to your doctor. So in summary, this is actually a paper from 2016. He put different triggers for autism and things to avoid. Some of this kind of spills over into Lanier's talk, Lanier Rossignol's talk on 2 weeks from today. But eventually, these things are all good ideas. So avoiding mitochondrial toxins. We mentioned some of these. Antibiotics. I certainly, wouldn't try to take antibiotics. We didn't mention anything. I didn't mention any specific studies, but this paper mentions it here. Tylenol, we know that. We're going to try to avoid that. Folate, metabolism, and absorption. Lanier, I believe, will be talking about that in addition to milk. Maternal infections, I believe she'll be talking about that as well. Autoimmune reactions. Managing the stress, I did mention that. It does seem to be an environmental risk factor. So, meditation, yoga, exercise, I find is just very, very helpful for detoxification and for stress. Just getting outdoors, but everybody's got their own methods. So you have to find what works. But us moms certainly have to take care of ourselves. That's a definite. Pre-postnatal toxins. So before you give birth, before you even get pregnant, during the pregnancy and afterwards, you want to avoid these toxins such as air pollution, solvents, the PCBs, phthalates, mercury, smoking, alcohol, all the things that we've mentioned in the studies. Poor diet, I believe Lanier is going to talk about that. But the weaning, so the recommendation is at least 6 months of constant breastfeeding if possible. Longer the better. So if you can do 12 months or, 18 months or 2 years, that seems to be protective, but 6 months is what everybody's recommending is the cutoff. Vitamin D seems to be helpful, and I think Lanier's going to mention that. Sleep hygiene, C-section, you want to avoid it if at all possible. And, I know we're always jumping the gun. I talked to a mom the other day. She said, they wanted to take it because I was, 41 weeks. I was 2 days over or something, my due date. And, some of these things we just really want to avoid C-section, just because it's not fitting into our schedule. But I understand life happens, but do the best you can. Helminths, that has more to do with the microbiome. I believe Lanier might be talking about that. These are things that definitely, in summary, that we want to look at before and during pregnancy. So if you're gonna plan a pregnancy, I would consider a summer conception, definitely. So, the summer months seem to be helpful. Spring and fall seem to be less risk factors, but I would avoid winter. Ensure adequate prenatal care. This is going back to talking to your doctor. See what medications you're on. Are your chronic conditions like your asthma, your seizures, are they controlled? And Lanier will talk about other things you want to test for preconception as well, as far as vitamin levels and metabolic, testing. Avoid all medications. Like I mentioned, less is always more, especially during pregnancy. The body knows best what it needs. So, and we don't know what everything that we're taking in our body is really doing. Even if the study says it's fine, who knows if it is. So Tylenol, definitely avoid. Avoid stress. We mentioned that. Again, best you can. Consider pregnancy spacing. The studies, as you saw, some were kind of inconclusive, but 2 to 5 years, most people are agreeing, is a good pregnancy spacing to reduce risk factor of autism. I would avoid any unnecessary ultrasounds, avoid C-sections, avoid delivery before 36 weeks. But again, most people aren't having deliveries before 36 weeks if you can avoid it. So, usually these are emergency type situations. And avoid inducing labor. So trying to let things run its most natural course is recommended. After delivery, like we mentioned again, breastfeeding, longer the better, at least 6 months though. I didn't mention this in a study, but for, typically in our clinic, we recommend supplementing an infant with 1,000 IUs of vitamin D for the first 3 years of life. It won't hurt them. A lot of kids are deficient now in vitamin D, and it can be very, very neuroprotective for them. So we recommend 1,000 for even infants. And then, you can consider probiotics even for infants, depending on what you think your, composition is or their composition. But I typically recommend 10 to 20 billion units per day for infants, just for the neuroprotective effect. I didn't mention it on here either, but I also do recommend typically some DHA blend too for infant formulas for the neuroprotective effects as well. And again, this is all times. This is all of us. We're all living in this world. We need to avoid toxins. So drink quality water. The best is typically reverse osmosis. Now, I have a, story. I thought my filter was working in my home, and apparently it wasn't completely installed correctly, and we were drinking essentially what I've now found out is moldy water because we had old pipes and probably lead water. So make sure you test the water, even if you think it's okay. It is good to get some quality testing, and I know there's some sort of lab companies out there that will do it for very inexpensive. Store food in glass. I really do try to avoid plastic and styrofoam, things that might impart chemicals. Glass is safe and stable. Bring your own containers, styrofoam in particular. I always see people drinking, out of these white styrofoam cups with this hot liquid, and it's very most definitely melting some of that styrofoam when you're ingesting it. So I think a lot of us know this by now, but it is good things to kind of remind yourself when possible to avoid. I didn't talk about this in the lecture, but mold exposure, I see it sometimes in my kids and in my family homes. So it's not obviously just a child issue, it's a household issue. So look for any water damage. Again, anything coming out of your, water supply in your home, and see, because that can cause a lot of oxidative stress and, make people quite sick if you're not looking for it. So keep an eye out of that. Using good cookware. Things like Teflon, and there's a lot of chemicals in a lot of the cookware that people use. The plastic spoons that get hot and things like that. So I always cook with either stainless steel cast iron or my ceramic. And I microwave, in glass, silicone, or non-chipped ceramic. In chipped ceramic, there can be some lead levels, so make sure that the ceramic has a good glaze and it's intact. So things to remind. And then, of course, we all know to avoid certain toxicants, phthalates. So if you have vinyl flooring in your home and you're walking around barefoot all day, maybe not the best. Avoiding plastics. Things like kids' toys. I'm seeing the kids put plastic in their mouth all the time, and you don't know what's coating those plastics or what's in the plastic. Household cleaning products. There is a lot of toxic chemicals sometimes that kids can be sensitive to, and parents in the cleaning products. So we typically use vinegar with infused, essential oils for some good aroma. But And, I do use bleach in the bathrooms, just, good for our GI issues, but definitely be very conscious of what you're spraying all over your house. Metal exposure, we all know about lead and some of the toys and things, paint, we've all heard of that. But just be conscious of it wherever you go, even in supplements. Some of these kids, some of these moms are taking a lot of supplements. I just recently read an article that there was lead in prenatal vitamins, a lot of them. So, you want to make sure that what you're buying, what you're putting in your mouth, isn't contaminated, because you could be doing a lot more harm than good. Mercury, of course, we know fish is a big issue. So I typically avoid a lot of it. I eat it once in a while, but you do need to stay away from the farmed fish and, try to find Alaskan wild caught. And it can be difficult to find, good fish. And you're not even really sure when you're eating it, where it's come from. And, you may test if there's a suspicion. So, parents a lot of times worry about toxicity. I say, well, there are certain lab providers out there that will offer tox screenings, and you can see what your body burden is. We've done this on my kids. We found that pollution, the benzenes, all the air pollution was in fact a really big issue. Pesticides didn't, tested nothing, but I'm really glad that we know that, because now I kind of know every room in my house has an air filter. We have tried to isolate. I try not to do too many outdoor activities when the smog is high, and I know that that's an issue for my children. Again, talk about avoiding Tylenol use in general. I think they should just get rid of it. I mean, if you have acute inflammation, I use Motrin unless you have a GI issue. So, of course, talk to your doctor. And eat organic. So we mentioned a lot about pesticides and how that can be a risk factor for autism. But there's also different chemicals. I mean, the big one is glyphosate. There was no studies here. I didn't mention it, but, I think Roundup is also a big issue in our food, and it's ever increasing every year in our food. And, theoretically in organic food, they're not allowed to use pesticides and or herbicides such as Roundup to kill off, but it's still found in our foods, even the organic, but the levels are significantly less. So that's what I've had parents say, well, it's still in there, but it's, usually a tenth of Roundup of what would be a non-Roundup, item. So eat organic, it's essential now for health. Filter air when possible, as I mentioned. That's what I do in my house. We have HEPA filters in each bedroom, and in the main living room. I don't know how much it's doing, but it seems to help. My kids do not cough at night, whereas they used to. My one son used to cough a lot, so I think it makes a difference. And again, just being aware of your environment. So that's my conclusion on the environmental piece of this. Again, if you have any questions about what I talked about or want to get a hold of me, my contact info is right there. And please stay tuned for Lanier's talk in 2 weeks for the metabolic piece of preconception.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole. We have time for a couple questions. So the first one, you talked about PCB. I heard that they're in a lot of mattresses. Does organic mean there's none in there?
Yeah, I believe it does. You know what? PCBs are found in mattresses. Absolutely. They put a ton of flame retardants, especially in the ones I've noticed that are the memory foam. They seem to, because I think they are a higher flame risk, they put even more in there. So I avoid all memory foam. And you have to talk to each manufacturer of mattresses, but that is supposed to be the claim, that organic, I believe, doesn't have the PCBs in it. But again, I think I would contact each specific manufacturer.
Oh, perfect. I've also heard that dyeing your hair is not recommended during pregnancy. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I've heard both back and forth. Now, I have not read any specific studies, so I can't speak too intelligently about it in a scientific manner, but I know that the MAPS physicians that I work with and I talk to, they don't recommend it. Typically, they don't dye their hairs. Again, less is more. So, I think there are some healthier hair dyes out there, and so you can kind of look at, they don't seem to be as permanent though. So, I would avoid it, especially during pregnancy. I did not dye my hair during pregnancy, but I can't lie, I have grays, so I dye my hair now. But I did avoid it during pregnancy and about 6 months. I mean, you want to give yourself a good 6 months of avoiding any toxicants that you wouldn't do while you're pregnant. Avoid it for 6 months prior to pregnancy, to conception. That's my general rule.
Perfect. And that kind of leads into this next question. I currently don't eat all organic. How long should I go organic before getting pregnant? So would the same be 6 months to get the pesticides out?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is variable depending on, depending on your genes, like we talked about. So some people will eliminate pesticides very quickly. Some people will retain them for months. So definitely, I mean, erring on the side of caution would be 6 months. But I tell people, I would recommend eating organic just in general. I mean, from now on kind of thing. But 6 months seems to be pretty safe. I also would take things to excrete toxins, such as the pesticides. So, for me, I take a daily dose of liposomal glutathione because I don't know what's in anything I'm exposed to. And I know I'm exposed. We're all exposed to all kinds of toxic chemicals. So, I've read some studies as far as the glyphosate. There's a pretty Roundup. There's a pretty good study that shows that humic acid can actually help eliminate it. So there are companies out there. I don't want to mention any names, but they make some metal pole products that have humic acid with other like chlorella and other natural things to help pull the pesticides and Roundup out of your body. Again, you'd probably want to use that under the direction of some kind of a physician or somebody, because if you're doing those kind of detox treatments, you would want to supplement with minerals and vitamins to help support you during the detox. So, with a lot of this stuff, you do want to consult a physician, or somebody that kind of knows. But yes, I would take things to try and aid the detoxification as well.
Perfect. The next question. DHA is currently not in the formula I'm giving my child. Should I be supplementing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it hurts, given though the caveat is that if the DHA is from a good source. So, fish oil has a lot of metal, specifically mercury contamination. And, I always go with Nordic Naturals. They have really, really good quality testing. Oh, oops, I'm not supposed to say that. Well, I go with certain brands. You can email me, but make sure you do your research. Make sure they're testing for metals. But yes, a good amount of any amount of good fat, should be well tolerated. I have a subset of kids that don't tolerate fish oil, but I would say that 95% of them do very well with it, in the DHA specifically. So there's products that you can just add in, drop it on the kid's tongue, or just add it into the formula.
Perfect. Okay, and then the last question. I currently need to pick an OB. Do you have any recommendations on bringing these issues up with them? Example, only doing necessary ultrasounds, not taking Tylenol, etc.
I don't know. I don't know any OBs that are specifically, kind of friendly to the MAPS idea, but I think a lot of them are. I mean, maybe you can talk to colleagues and talk to TACA. I mean, I know TACA is a great resource, and they might be able to guide you towards more, environmentally friendly OBs. But most of them agree, don't do Tylenol. And a lot of the stuff you're going to have to just kind of take on yourself. I mean, unfortunately, we live in an age, or fortunately, where we have so much access to data that we can make our own decisions. Your doctor can tell you, hey, Tylenol's fine, but, you can say, hey, I mean, I attended a webinar where there was, 30 studies that said it wasn't fine. So, you can make your own decisions. No one can force you to do an ultrasound. No one can force you, to do a C-section that you don't want to do prematurely. So, but I don't have any specific recommendations for which doctors are, more friendly than not.
Perfect. All right. Those are all the questions. Thank you so much, Nicole, for being here and presenting this information from us. And like you said, Lanier's webinar is in 2 weeks, and it's going to kind of follow up to this one. Also, if you fill out the survey, you should be getting it within an hour. You will get the slides from today's presentation. So please go and fill that out. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, Nicole. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you too.
Bye.